light in the snow. The first winter after Thomas didn't come home was the coldest anyone in the village could remember. Snow lay on the fields for weeks, packed hard enough that the children skated on the frozen ditches. The lane from the main road to Bellwether Farm became a narrow white corridor flanked by hedgerows that looked like skeletons, and the sound of boots or hooves carried for miles. Margaret Bellwether, 23 and widowed by silence rather than death, kept the lantern burning in her kitchen window from dusk until dawn. She told the neighbors it was in case Thomas found his way back, that he might see it across the fields. But even she knew how far away France was. The lantern itself was an old thing, tarnished brass and glass with a crack running through one pane. Thomas had taken it out to the barn one morning the previous winter and come back with his eyebrows singed, cursing softly at the soot. He'd cleaned the chimney with vinegar and declared it good as new. That night, he'd read to her by its light something from Kipling, half serious and half joking about soldiers and duty, and she'd laughed, telling him he made a dreadful actor. He'd kissed her, and the next week he was gone. When the telegram came, she read it standing by the same window. Missing, presumed, it said, the ink blotting slightly on the paper. The words didn't seem to mean anything. The rector had offered platitudes, her sister had offered prayers, and the men at the post office had offered their condolences in that stiff, embarrassed way men did when they wanted to escape a woman's tears. But Margaret hadn't cried then. She'd simply lit the lantern. Until he finds his way home, she'd whispered. The habit caught on. A few cottages down the lane began to hang their own lights for sons and husbands and brothers at the front. By the second winter, the whole village glowed faintly at night, a constellation of grief and hope across the dark hills. She aged quietly. The war ended. The men returned, or didn't. The newspapers moved on to peace treaties, then to shortages, then to rebuilding. Margaret learned to run the farm herself. Her hands hardened, her back ached, and her hair turned grey before she realized she'd stopped expecting the crunch of boots on the frozen path outside. Still, every Christmas Eve, she polished the brass lantern and lit it before dark. Neighbors would stop by with cakes or jam, gently trying to persuade her to come into town for the parish celebration, but she always declined. Someone has to keep the light, she'd say with a small smile. And they would nod, not sure whether it was devotion or stubbornness that kept her there. Years passed. A new generation grew up calling her the Widow Bellwether, as though widow were her Christian name. She grew fond of them, the children who sledded down her hill, the postman who always brought an extra orange at Christmas, the young couple who rented her north field. And one winter morning in 1939, she stood at the gate and watched the village men march off again. Different uniforms, same haunted eyes. She was 55 then, too old to be of use and too young to be entirely at peace. That year, blackout regulations forbade lights after dusk. But Margaret couldn't bring herself to darken her window on Christmas Eve. She wrapped a blanket around the lantern to dim it, saying a quiet apology to whatever official might fine her for it. Outside, the snow fell softly, burying the world in silence. She thought she heard footsteps on the lane that night, steady, measured, just like Thomas's had been. But when she opened the door, there was nothing except the snow and the distant rumble of planes. When peace came again, she didn't celebrate. She only bought a new wick for the lantern, polished the brass, and lit it once more. By the 1960s, the farm was more weeds than wheat. Margaret's niece, Clara, came from London each December to check on her. Clara was a nurse, efficient and kind, but always rushing, her world filled with telephones and car horns. "Honestly, Aunt Maggie," she said one evening, tugging at her gloves, "you shouldn't be alone out here. You're 78. The pipes will freeze, and so will you." "I have the fire," Margaret said mildly. "And the light." Clara rolled her eyes. "That old thing? It's never gone out." "That's because you're daft enough to keep it going," Clara muttered, but there was affection in her tone. She kissed her aunt's cheek and left in her small car, headlights vanishing down the snowy lane. That night, Margaret set the lantern in the window and felt, for the first time, a strange heaviness in her chest. Not grief. She'd lived with that for decades, but something deeper. The sense that the world was moving past her and she was fading into its wake. In 1971, the post office closed. The last of the old shops followed. The village became a smattering of houses with names instead of numbers, the kind of place people drove through on their way to somewhere else. Margaret wrote letters to Clara less often. Her hands trembled too much, and the young families who'd once helped with the harvest had long since moved away. Still, each Christmas Eve, the light burned. That final winter came early. By the second week of December, frost glittered on the hedges all day, and the pump in the yard had to be thawed each morning with a kettle of boiling water. She felt it in her bones that this would be her last. She rose before dawn on Christmas Eve and walked through the snow to the barn. The air smelled of hay and iron and memories. She opened Thomas's old chest, still there, still locked, the brass key kept on a string around her neck, and took out his uniform cap. The fabric had faded to a soft greenish brown. She brushed it off and set it on the table beside the lantern. "I suppose I've kept my promise long enough," she said quietly. "If you've found your way home, my love, you'll know where to look." That evening, she lit the lantern for the last time. It burned steadily for hours, its warm glow reflected in the frost on the window pane. Outside, the snow began to fall, slowly, softly, as if the sky itself were exhaling. Sometime after midnight, the flame flickered, then steadied again. When Clara arrived 2 days later, the fire in the fireplace had gone out. The tea on the stove was cold, and Margaret was sitting by the window, eyes half closed, the lantern beside her guttering its last. She looked peaceful, almost expectant, Clara thought. Clara wept quietly as she tidied the little house, not quite knowing what else to do. She packed a small box of keepsakes, the cap, the wedding photo, and the diary Margaret had kept since 1915. The diary was a surprise. The first half was what she expected, short entries about the weather, letters received or not received, livestock notes. But near the end, the handwriting changed. It appeared softer, slower. The final pages told a story Clara had never heard. December 1917. Snow. A knock on the door, just before dawn. A man in uniform. Not Thomas, but carrying Thomas's satchel. Inside was a letter addressed to me, unsigned. He said they'd been trapped for days in a ruined farmhouse near Ypres. Thomas had saved his life. He hadn't seen him fall, only heard him shouting something about the light, and then he'd gone. The letter itself had been written in a trembling hand, probably by candlelight. It was brief. "If I can't find the road home, I'll look for your light. Keep it burning, love, and I'll follow it, no matter how long the winter." Beneath the note was something Clara hadn't noticed before. A faint watermark across the paper. Bellwether and Sons Paper Company. The name sent a shiver through her. She didn't know why, just that it felt like the closing of a circle she hadn't realized was open. She set the diary aside and walked to the window. Outside, the snow had begun again, thick and silent. Across the valley, she could see the village roofs, and in one or two windows, the faint golden glow of lanterns. She smiled through her tears. The tradition had outlived its founder. When she left the next morning, she carried the brass lantern with her, tucked carefully among her bags. Clara lived in a flat in London, a place of buses and grey stone and the constant murmur of other people's lives. She placed the lantern on her kitchen windowsill that winter, uncertain why. Perhaps out of sentiment, perhaps out of some kind of subconscious guilt. When she lit it on Christmas Eve, the flame flickered once, caught, and then burned cleanly. The light threw soft reflections against the glass, and for a moment she thought she saw movement in the street below, a man in an old military coat walking slowly through the drifting snow. He didn't look up. He just paused under the lamplight, turned his head as if listening, and then vanished into the white. That night, Clara dreamed of the farm. She saw her aunt at the window, young again, lantern in hand, smiling, and behind her, half in shadow, stood a man in uniform, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. When Clara woke, the room was filled with a faint, unfamiliar scent, oil and cold air, and something else she couldn't name. The flame in the lantern had gone out, though she was certain she'd left it burning. She touched the glass lightly. It was warm. The years passed. London changed as cities do. But each December, Clara lit the lantern again. Neighbors began asking about it, and she'd tell the story of how her aunt had kept the light for a husband lost in the Great War, and how the village had followed her example. People liked the idea. It spread. By the 1990s, articles appeared in local papers about the light in the snow tradition. Small towns keeping a candle in their windows at Christmas to guide loved ones home. Few remembered where it began or who Margaret Bellwether had been. But sometimes, in the right kind of snowfall, a faint figure was said to walk the lanes near the old farm with a cap pulled low, carrying a lantern whose flame never died. And somewhere, in a forgotten drawer in Clara's flat, the diary still rested. The ink had faded, but one phrase remained perfectly clear, as if the paper itself refused to let it go. "Keep it burning, love, and I'll follow it, no matter how long the winter." Outside, the snow began to fall again, softly, steadily, until the city itself seemed to disappear beneath its hush. And in 1,000 windows, from London to the smallest country hamlet, little lights flickered in the darkness, each one, perhaps, remembering the first.